Wurm Online has finally released their 2024 roadmap and they are telling us it's all good. But is it actually? Let's talk about it. G'day everybody, my name is Bloody Drongo and today we are going to be taking a look at the state of Wurm. It's good, which is a post from Samul. It's a roadmap for the development of Wurm Online in 2024. Samul, of course, is the product manager for Wurm Online, aka the person who is driving the ship at the moment in terms of development and the overall product of Wurm Online. So it's definitely worth paying attention to, and there is a lot of stuff in here that is quite interesting, and some of it's good, and some of it is a little bit more controversial and has certainly got some of the community in a bit of a tizzy. First off the rank is Samuel gets into some of the financial aspects of Game Chest Group, which is the parent company of Wurm, of course. I have a lot to say about this, but it's all nerd stuff, so I'm going to leave that to the end of the video once I've covered off the game relevant stuff. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, just wait until the end of the video. I'll come back to this. And then that way, people who don't care about that sort of stuff don't have to listen to me talk about it. First cab off the rank is the action rework. Now, this was something that was teased by Buddha at the end of last year, and it is going to be a massive overhaul to the code that handles player actions in the game. It's going to be focused on adding in quality of life features to make Wurm better to play, adding in new tool belt mechanics, adding in a new quick bar, new UI elements. It's going to have a visible action queue and also going to be basically consolidating a lot of the key binds that you can do to a single key and make that a lot more intuitive and a lot easier. Now, I think this makes a lot of sense, and this is something that will benefit not only new players that come into the game and hopefully make the way they interact with the game world a lot more intuitive and easy to understand, but also benefit everybody who plays the game, because let's face it, Wurm is generally a pretty click heavy game, and mapping keybinds and having different keybind settings and profiles and all kinds of stuff is a bit of a nightmare to manage sometimes. So anything they can do to simplify that is going to be a good thing. Not only that, but Buddha has talked about in the past the fact that a lot of the groundwork that is being done now to actually make this action rework possible will also be serving as the framework to introduce further quality of life improvements down the track as well. So hopefully this is just the first in a slew of improvements to the quality of life and how you actually interact with the game world for Wurm, which is very exciting. The timeline for this at the moment that they have outlined, they've said that they're going to be allowing public testing of the feature shortly, that we can expect an announcement on this in the coming weeks, which is pretty soon. It could be the case that we could see something playable before the end of March or not long after that, which is absolutely really exciting. The next thing to talk about is the client work. So we were given another teaser of this again at the end of last year, talking about the lighting improvements and optimizations they are wanting to overhaul in the game. This has expanded into a complete terrain overhaul, and they have said that it's going to make the terrain look better, and it's also going to make the improve drastically improved, which is a pretty strong word to use. And I mean, I'm certainly going to be somebody who is happy about a better looking game that runs better. There's no downside to that. So fingers crossed that that actually has the desired effect. And certainly from a player experience perspective, especially at community-based events, large community gatherings like slayings and impalongs and stuff like that, game performance is really poor. And hopefully they will be able to improve that and make that a much less troublesome experience for people. Next up is something that we knew was going to be coming, but we didn't really have any concept of what that might look like at the end of last year. And that is going to be the overhaul of the tutorial experience of Wurm Online. They are releasing the New Haven tutorial experience, which is quite similar to what we used to have going back 10 years ago or so now as the Golden Valley, which was a isolated new player server that was dedicated to new players being introduced to the game and then having a dedicated server to kind of find their footing before being introduced into the mainland servers. Now, that was definitely not a great framework originally, and there was a lot of things that should have been done differently with Golden Valley, in my opinion. They seem to touch on that fact in this post, which does give me hope that we aren't just going to be repeating ourselves and going back in time to 10 years ago and saying, yeah, this is an improvement, we're moving forwards. They're going to be making it less dangerous and faster for new players to start on. They're also going to be adding in a quest system to help introduce the game to new players in bite-size pieces to make the game less overwhelming, which I think makes a lot of sense. And they're also talking about the possibility of allowing new players to be able to pick up their houses and leave the tutorial server with their built house. So, which is kind of an interesting idea, but that is to combat a phenomenon that Golden Valley used to have, in that a lot of players would spend, there was no time limit of how long you could spend on Golden Valley, and even though you were capped in your skills and a lot of the resources that you get, and you were basically getting like less than half the game experience, there was a dedicated segment of the player base that just wanted to live on Golden Valley and never left, which meant that Golden Valley had its own community, it had its own economy. It was just a very weird phenomenon and definitely not what was intended. And I think overall, having an isolated community to that isn't linked with the general population of the game is in the long term going to be a detriment. So it's good that they're looking at ways to address that. They haven't said that that's what they're going to do, but that's just one of the solutions to stop players getting overly invested and wanting to stay on New Haven indefinitely. I think one thing that makes a lot of sense to me is that after X amount of playtime, they are kind of prompted or forced to move on to the main servers, and will be able to keep, I honestly, I'm not opposed to a new player being able to keep their house. I think that's, it's weird, and I don't know how that works within the game lore, but I'm not opposed to it. I think it makes a lot of sense. The other big thing, and this is probably a ramification not only to new players, but to all players, and that is the expansion of the mechanics to allow land protection outside of deeds. Because right now, for a new player coming into the game, they are kind of forced to go down one of three options. Number one is living off deed and having to put up with no item protection, having no real rights, and a protection from griefing, and really high decay on their fences and houses and stuff, which kind of sucks as a player experience. Number two, joining up with a new village, which a lot of new players will probably overlook the importance of how much easier that they can make their player experience, and they'll generally want to try and strive and hit it out by themselves first before they consider that more communal aspect to the game. And thirdly, the option is to actually get them to pay for a deed and to shell up money up front whilst they're still very new to the game and not really invested. And I think that's a big turn off for a lot of players. This is a compromise to that, and I think that's a pretty good idea. But they are stating here that this will likely extend onto making living off deed more viable on all servers, which is a pretty big overhaul, and that would likely come in conjunction with an overhaul of the in-game rules, because right now the in-game rules as written are generally considered to be deed it or lose it. So that's a pretty major update there. The next thing is another more controversial update, and this one I don't think was on anybody's real radars, and that is portals. So they're going to be introducing a new portal mechanic, allowing you to teleport from any server to any other server, as well as between starter deeds on the same server. So this will essentially shrink down the game world, and obviously a lot of players are not exactly a fan of this, because a big component of Wurm's appeal is the exploration aspect, and also the aspect of people coming together to create logistics, like the actual highway and infrastructure to be able to, for players to get around efficiently on the map. And this idea does undermine that concept and that ethos that is at the very heart of Wurm's core That being said, I do think this still makes sense, especially from a new player perspective, helping to reduce the number of hurdles for new players to be able to join up with their friends, make decisions about, oh, actually, I want to go and test out this server, or I want to find a new area to go and live in, and allowing people to not get as tied down or being able to remove themselves from situations that they're not necessarily enjoying is a positive for new player retention. Additionally to this, it will be coming with a North Freedom Isles and Southern Freedom Isles link, which will mean that players, characters, coins, skills will all cross between those two server clusters, which was previously completely isolated. I know that there is going to be a lot of people, especially on the Northern Freedom Isles, that are going to be unhappy about this change because the economy there is very much more expensive and more profitable than Southern Freedom Isles, and that there is going to be probably an influx of players coming from Southern Freedom Isles going to Northern Freedom Isles to try and take advantage of those greener pastures. So there's going to be some pretty major shakeups and ramifications for the economy and the player bases in those two clusters. I personally was always against having separate server clusters for Northern Freedom Isles and Southern Freedom Isles. And I generally consider the idea of merging the two clusters long-term to be an ideal situation, because I think having isolated populations over the long term will be a detriment to the player base. But that being said, I don't really have too much of a horse in the race, considering I don't play on Northern Freedom Isles and I do play on Southern Freedom Isles, and I have no desire to change that. It'll be interesting to see how that works out and what people do with that. And it is worth mentioning here at this point, because it says upcoming months, and that kind of segments this out. So this would suggest to me that Portals, New Haven, Client Work, and the Action Rework are all probably scheduled to be within the next month, maybe 2 months at the most, based off of this wording, which is pretty exciting. Even if you aren't a fan of some of these changes, I still think there's a lot to get excited about here, regardless. But it also means that there's plenty of stuff to look forward to in the second half of this year, which is good, because I think, generally speaking, the pace of development, especially in 2023, was not the quickest, and it will be really a confidence building for the community. I know myself, I will be definitely bolstered in my hope for the long-term longevity of the game if we are able to see pace of development pick up, because 2023, I think they did a lot of talking, and yes, they did deliver on a few things, but it felt like it took a really, really long time. And admittedly, there is still stuff that from 2023 that we're still waiting for, so we'll see what happens there. But this is certainly an optimistic framing of things, if this is to be believed. First off, we have PvE content. So they apparently plan on releasing this update soon after the New Haven update. It'll include goblin camps, a new feature looking for exploration and combat, as well as a building expansion planned to include ceilings, docks, and new wall types. So a few major things there to take note of. Number one, goblin camps, which we have been waiting for ages. It has been delayed and delayed and delayed. The can has kept getting kicked down the road, and it is really exciting to know that maybe we will actually get that this year. A new feature is always exciting. It's very vague there, but adding in exploration and combat, I think is good. I would love to see an update that would make combat more interesting and more interactive, as opposed to being the kind of the combat scrolling slog that we have now. Maybe add in a way to grind cartography skill that is not as awful as it is currently, because it just kind of sucks to grind as a skill. So yeah, we'll see what happens there. And finally, the building expansion, new building materials and everything like that. I know both myself and a lot of other players in the game, we love the building in Wurm. We love the customization. And that is the core part of the game that we really find appealing, is that creative aspect. And certainly the idea of new options being available to us is one that is going to be positive and an easy win for the game. Next up is the character customization rework. Now, this has been something that has been long requested and has been just well overdue. Right now, the Wurm customization for characters is pretty lacking. It generally scales from how white do you want to be and, you know, what color hair do you want to have. That's kind of it. Like, it's very, very basic. It's very boring. There's not a lot of options. And with a game that is so heavily oriented towards players being able to represent themselves how they choose to, whether that is with their buildings, whether that is with their pets, their horses, their mounts, their skins, you know, all these different aspects, their armor, weapons, you know, there's all of these different customizations. So much of this game is about creativity and being able to kind of customize your experience. And yet the character customization is very, very lacking in comparison. So I think this makes a lot of sense, and I'm super positive about the idea of having this implemented. Finally, in the upcoming month section, we have the in-game auction house, and this is perhaps the most controversial aspect that was made in this roadmap announcement. And out of the 4 pages of comments that we currently have in this thread, the vast majority of them are asking questions or voicing concerns about the in-game auction house. Now, I can see both sides of the argument. On one side of things, you have a significant part of the player base that is very much valuing the interpersonal interactions on the forums and in the game to buy and sell items. Like, that is for them, with their role playing as kind of like a merchant, and or even like pseudo role playing. Like, that's just how they choose to identify as like, oh, I'm a Wurm trader. That is a big part of their gameplay experience, and this directly undermines that part of the game that they value. That being said, on the flip side, I think the majority of players don't really care about the interaction that much, and are just there for quality of life. And you know, there's a lot of players that will pick up an MMO these days that don't really want to go on the forums to get access to auctions and things like that. Like, that's a very old-fashioned way of doing things. And the other big thing, in my opinion, that has to be kind of a factor here, and there's been a few people that have touched on it. One of the unique things about Wurm is that it doesn't have an auction house. So many MMOs do have auction houses. Wurm is unique, and by adding in an auction house, you actually actively take away one of the things that makes Wurm unique. And I personally agree with that statement, but I don't think that that aspect of uniqueness is necessarily a great thing for the game. And when you think about it from a new player's perspective, the idea of a in-game auction house is so synonymous with MMORPGs that it's going to be a lot more new player friendly to have a familiar structure like that in the game to be able to interact with the in-game economy than something that is a little bit less approachable, such as traveling literal hours as a new player without a horse, without a mount, to a in-game market to purchase, you know, your first set of tools or something like that, or to sign up to a forum, which maybe they've never used a forum before. Maybe they just don't want to sign up to a forum. It's an added hurdle that is not inbuilt within the game that just doesn't make a lot of sense from a new player experience. So I think this is slightly more positive, but I can also very much understand why a lot of people would be against this. Whether or not this will be a healthy change for the game in the long term, that remains to be seen, but it is certainly the most controversial aspect that was announced here. Finally, there is going to be they touch on the longer term projects that are there, so the PvP updates and that kind of thing that have been long kicked down the road. They're looking into it. I would be pretty pissed off if I was part of the PvP community. They have been pretty well snubbed over the past few years, to be honest. Like, the state of the PvP side of the game in Wurm is very much undervalued, and I think also underinvested in from a development perspective. I think it makes a lot of sense to focus on the new player experience, because I do think that is the number one problem that is facing Wurm, is that new player retention. However, these PvP updates and tweaks and balancing and stuff like that, that should have been more firmly looked at 4 or 5 years ago. Like, it's just a shame that it hasn't been done sooner, and there's no real promise or commitment that this will actually happen even this year. So that's kind of the main stuff there. There is also the map dumps that have come out, so that's kind of interesting. I haven't had a chance to go through in detail to look at the map dumps yet, but that is no doubt going to be interesting to some people. So if you want to go and look at your deed on the map dump, go and have a look. That is now out there now. Finally, now we're to the end. And so if you're somebody who is only interested in the Wurm updates, great. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you found this useful. Leave a comment down below and let me know what you are most excited for out of this stuff, and maybe what you're most concerned about as well. What do you think is going to be the worst aspect to these round of updates? Because I know there's a lot of strong opinions out there. Let's go on to the Q4 2023 performance. Now, Samuel starts out by saying that GCG, Game Chess Group, has finally turned a profit. Uses the word finally turned a profit, thanks to Wurm, and that he has linked the report for Game Chess Group. And the headline for this is Game Chess Group reports a slightly lower EBITDA. So for those of you who don't know what EBITDA is, it means earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization. And basically it's a super simple measurement to evaluate the amount of cash that a company is bringing in after all of their major commitments. And generally speaking, a higher EBITDA is better. And even though it is lower compared to 2022, 2023 is still decent. It has changed from a 33% margin to a 26.9% margin. And there is a statement here from Krista basically saying that, hey, you know, we've streamlined and optimized processes. We have made efforts to reduce costs, and we've managed to increase turnover. And indeed, they list here that their net sales have increased from 2.4 million Swedish krona to 2.6, which is an 8.3% change. However, if they have reduced costs whilst also managed to increase their net sales, I would expect their EBITDA to improve, not reduce. So there is some, like, this is a very, very basic overview. There is not a lot of information here, and certainly I would be skeptical looking at this because it doesn't tell the full story. So there's still some information here that we're not being given. And it does seem as though the reaction from the Swedish stock market was as skeptical as I would be as well. And that is reflected by the fact that in the lead up to this report being announced, you can see that the speculation of the share price has kind of improved a bit, coming up and indeed spiked at 0.52 Swedish krona, which is, you know, pretty good, especially considering, you know, that it has decreased quite a bit over the last 12 months. However, after the report was released, we can see that it has decreased pretty significantly down to a bottom of 0.3 Swedish krona. The peak of the share price was in the start of 2023 when they basically brought on Krista Elgrim, the new CEO, and a bunch of new investors, and they all bought in at the 0.35 Swedish krona mark. And the fact that it is going now potentially below that 0.35 is worth noting, because it does mean that those stakeholders will actively be losing money on their investment if that share price doesn't improve, which could increase the pressure from behind the scenes for Wurm to become more profitable, improve their EBITDA, and to be able to put out more impressive quarterly reports to attract new stakeholders in and buy up the shares. So it's definitely interesting to look at this, and certainly the information that we've been given, I don't think there's any major concerns. There's certainly no massive red flags. However, it's definitely not as good as maybe they would want us to think it is. There's definitely some other stuff that's still going on in the background there that they're just being selective as to what information we are privy to. So yeah, that's overall the state of Wurm in 2024. And I think it is good. I think I would put my good with a question mark at the end, because it sounds good, but like, Wurm has put out pretty good roadmaps before, and they've pretty consistently failed to deliver on a lot of different stuff that they've outlined in roadmaps. So I have a big asterisk as to whether we will see any of this stuff actually come to fruition. Hopefully we will see, with the relatively short time frame that a lot of this stuff is implied to be being brought into the game, that it is realistic that we will see this stuff. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments of this video. If you enjoyed it and you want to see more of this type of content, make sure you leave a like. I've been Bloody Drongo, and I will catch you in the next one. Take care.